In this lecture, we'll pick up and we'll discuss the first of the three processes involved in renal physiology, and that's going to be glomerular filtration. Alright, as we start this discussion about glomerular filtration, the first concept we want to address here is actually the filtration membrane. This obviously is the membrane across which blood will be filtered, and this image here shows you, or at least a diagrams for you rather, the membrane over which that filtration occurs. You'll need to keep in mind the three components of that membrane, and you kind of see them listed for you over here. The first component is the wall of the glomerulus. Now, the glomerulus itself is a capillary. It's a specific type of capillary, however, and that's going to be a fenestrated capillary. So, the first major component of the filtration membrane will be the fenestrated endothelium of the glomerulus. And you can see that represented here in yellow. You see the endothelium with the small, tiny fenestrations within it. Second major component is the basal lamina. The basal lamina is essentially like the basement membrane. This is another layer to the filtration membrane, obviously, that whatever is being filtered must move through. And the third and final component of that filtration membrane is comprised of cells called podocytes. These podocytes make up the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. What happens is the podocytes have long finger-like extensions called pedicles. These pedicles interlock like fingers, and what that creates in between them are small, tiny gaps called filtration slits. So those are your three layers to the filtration membrane. You have the fenestrated endothelium along with the basal lamina, and then these filtration slits are formed by the interlocking pedicles of the podocytes. Now, based upon this, you're going to be able to see certain items be filtered, and certain items should be inhibited from being filtered at this filtration membrane. It's easiest to try and keep a list of what cannot be filtered, because the list of what can be filtered is fairly extensive. So what cannot be filtered at this filtration membrane will include basically your formed elements, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Those will not be capable of being filtered. Additionally, many of the plasma proteins should be inhibited from being filtered as well. For our purposes, we'll treat it as if the plasma proteins are not filtered at all. However, the reality is very small plasma proteins and some amino acids may possibly be filtered at that filtration membrane. So your red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, along with the plasma proteins are prevented from being filtered. Partially, this prevention is based upon the size. These items are all very large, and they have a difficult time fitting through the fenestrations along with those filtration slits. And partially, it's a charge-based prevention. If you look at many of the plasma proteins that have a negative charge, and the basal lamina is also negatively charged, so as the negatively charged plasma proteins begin to approach the negatively charged basal lamina, the negatives repel one another, and that can help prevent filtration of the some of the at least plasma proteins. Now, to begin to talk about the process of filtration itself, what you need to appreciate is the fact that filtration is a movement of fluid. We're moving fluid from the inside of that glomerulus and into this area here, which is the capsular space. And in physics, whenever fluids move, they always do so by moving from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So essentially, the process of filtration itself is driven by a force. It's driven by a pressure. The pressure is going to force the fluid from the inside of the glomerulus and into that capsular space. So in order to figure out this force or this pressure, what we need to do is summarize all the forces that are going to try and cause fluid to go from the glomerulus and into the capsular space, and we must subtract from that force all the forces trying to drive fluid from the capsular space back into the glomerulus. If the forces trying to drive fluid from the glomerulus into the capsular space are greater than those trying to force it in the opposite direction, then we should get filtration, meaning we should get movement of the fluid from the glomerulus and into the capsular space. The force that drives filtration, glomerular filtration that is referred to as net filtration pressure. It is a difference between all the forces trying to drive fluid out of the glomerulus and all those forces trying to force fluid into the glomerulus. Now we take a look, there's some specific forces, and we'll begin with something called the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure. The glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure is determined by the amount of blood within the glomerulus. and literally that blood is trying to force its way out of the glomerulus and into the capsular space. So the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure is a major force trying to drive blood from the glomerulus into the capsular space. And on average, our glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure within the renal corpuscle is around 55 millimeters of mercury. Next, let's take a look at all those forces trying to force fluid from the capsular space into the glomerulus. The first of these is going to be the capsular hydrostatic pressure. So the fluid within the capsular space is also going to try and exert a force, and that force is going to try to drive fluid from the capsular space back into the glomerulus. You see it represented here with the purple arrows. The average capsular hydrostatic pressure, 15 millimeters of mercury. There's also a force exerted by the solutes flowing through the blood. We'll call this the blood colloid osmotic pressure, and we're specifically in that situation looking at the plasma proteins. Those plasma proteins are going to try and draw fluid back into our glomerulus. So the blood colloid osmotic pressure on average, around 30 millimeters of mercury. So we do the math and take the difference between all the forces promoting filtration, which for our purposes is only glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure at 55, and then we subtract from it and get the difference between that force and the forces trying to promote fluid moving back into the glomerulus, which would be the capsular hydrostatic pressure and blood colloid osmotic pressure. We get a difference of 10 millimeters of mercury, positive 10 millimeters of mercury. That means that fluid is being forced from the glomerulus into the capsular space due to this plus 10 millimeter of mercury difference. Now, that's the story behind net filtration. At its essence, I absolutely need you to understand what the driving force behind filtration is. And if you look at it, it's kind of simple to see from the number standpoint. The highest number wins. The biggest number dominates. 55 versus 15 versus 30. Well, it's the 55 of the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure that becomes dominant. Therefore, that 55 is what drives filtration at the glomerulus. It is the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure that is driving filtration. Now, when we look at filtration, we also like to evaluate how much filtrate is formed over a given time period. Now, there's different ways to kind of measure this and evaluate it, but the concept that we're starting to bridge into and talk about here is called glomerular filtration rate. The way this works is that your kidneys have to form a certain amount of filtrate per unit of time in order to maintain their proper function. So you have to force enough fluid out of the glomerulus into the capsular space per given unit of time in order to maintain proper kidney function. Like I said, the amount of fluid forced out per unit of time, we refer to that as glomerular filtration rate, and you'll probably hear me refer to it as GFR from here on out because that's a short acronym for it. Now, like I said, GFR can be measured in different ways. If we took it and we looked at it per day, we could say the average GFR is around 180 liters per day. If we look at it per minute, we could say the average GFR is around 125 milliliters per minute. Now, going back to what we just said, remember, filtration is determined basically by glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure. So if we expand that on backwards, we could also say, essentially, your GFR is determined by your glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure. Now, from a realistic standpoint, that glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure is typically most commonly linked to your systemic blood pressure. So there's a sort of linkage that you need to start to make here. Blood pressure, in part, determines glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure, and that, in part, determines filtration rate. So as your blood pressure changes, in theory, you should see a change in your filtration rate. But remember, you have to form enough filtrate or have a GFR that's in an acceptable range in order for your kidneys to work correctly. So typically what we see is that although our blood pressure can change on a variable basis, we don't have dramatic swings in our glomerular filtration rate. Our glomerular filtration rate remains fairly steady. The reason is because glomerular filtration is very tightly regulated. Now, we're going to make a transition here to a table that you'll find within your text, and it's table 26.2. As you see at the top there, it says regulation of glomerular filtration rate. These are the mechanisms in play to help maintain GFR within its normal homeostatic range. First complete concept here is called renal autoregulation. Then we'll look at neuroregulation and also follow that with hormonal regulation. Renal autoregulation refers to the ability of the kidneys themselves to help regulate their blood pressure, or rather their filtration rate, in part. So the kidneys themselves can regulate that GFR. If we take a look, there's two components to renal autoregulation. They're called the myogenic mechanism and also tubulo-glomerular feedback. In the myogenic mechanism, it's muscle literally that causes the regulation of GFR. If we go back to our diagrams, we'll go to here, and I'm going to scroll back a little bit to our image here of the renal corpuscle. Cells located within the afferent arteriole, here and here, called juxtaglomerular cells, are the cells that mediate the myogenic mechanism. These juxtaglomerular cells are actually modified smooth muscle cells. They're modified from the standpoint that they don't work like normal smooth muscle. Most smooth muscle by design is designed to relax when you put pressure on it. However, in response to extreme pressure or extreme stretch, the juxtaglomerular cells instead contract, causing constriction. Now the way this plays out is that, let's just say for instance your systemic blood pressure is increasing. One of the things that happens hemodynamically is that when your pressure increases, the velocity of the blood flow also would increase. So the speed of the blood flowing through your entire body is going to pick up. Well, that would affect the speed of the blood flowing through the afferent arteriole. As the blood flows faster, literally, more blood in a given amount of time would try and force its way through the afferent arteriole. Now these arterioles have compliance, so in response to that additional blood that tries to force its way through, they have to expand, they have to stretch. And what the JG cells are designed to do is recognize the fact that the increasing amount of stretch correlates with a higher blood pressure. And the chart tells you that here. So we see here the major stimulus for the myogenic mechanism. Remember, it's carried out by the JG cells. It's stretching of the JG cells, which are smooth muscle, in the afferent arteriole. That stretching occurs as the velocity of blood flow picks up, more blood tries to force its way through the afferent arteriole, and that indicates an increased blood pressure. Now remember, we have to maintain GFR. We can't have it go too high. So in order to bring our GFR back down, what the JG cells do to that in response to that increased stretch is they contract. When they contract, this narrows the lumen of the afferent arteriole. And as that lumen narrows, we're going to see a decrease in the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure, and that decrease therefore is then passed on, and the overall net effect is a decrease on our GFR. The second effect here with renal autoregulation is going to be tubulo-glomerular feedback. In this situation, the renal tubule is going to do something to affect what's happening within the glomerulus. Hence the name, tubulo-glomerular feedback. Tubulo-glomerular feedback is a function of a collection of cells seen here within the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. These cells are collectively called the macula densa. The macula densa cells typically are able to make nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So as long as these macula densa cells are releasing nitric oxide, they try to cause dilation or enlargement of this afferent arteriole. However, should your blood pressure once again go too high, remember, we want to try and regulate GFR and decrease it by causing constriction of this afferent arteriole. So literally what happens during a situation where your glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure is rising and your GFR therefore would also be rising, these macula densa cells will stop making nitric oxide. Once they stop making nitric oxide, no longer will they have the afferent arteriole, no longer would it have the stimulus to dilate, therefore it should be allowed to contract. Now the key question is going to become, what actually is going to allow the macula densa to know that the pressure is increased? So we need to go back to our chart here and take a look at that. The stimulus is the amount of sodium and chloride that's flowing past those cells within the macula densa. When that systemic blood pressure picks up, the glomerular blood hydrostatic pressure picks up in turn, and therefore you start to filter your GFR also, would increase as well. You will form more filtrate, and the more filtrate you dump into the capsular space, well, the faster the fluid flowing through the renal tubule would move. So this means that there would be more sodium and more chloride flowing faster past that macula densa over a given period of time. The macula densa would detect that. It would interpret it as being an increased systemic blood pressure. It would begin to lower or decrease its release of nitric oxide, and this would allow for constriction of the afferent arteriole, leading to an overall decrease in the GFR. So that's renal autoregulation. You can see a couple of key components there, but I would encourage you to keep in mind each one of the four columns: type of regulation, major stimulus, mechanism and site of action, and the effect on GFR for renal autoregulation. Next up, neuroregulation. And the neuroregulation primarily involves the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is a division of the nervous system that's responsible for your ability to fight or run for your life. And the usual way that I phrase this out is by saying simply this. If you're going to fight or run for your life, you don't need to make urine. So essentially, you don't need the amount of blood flowing to your kidneys that you normally would have. But you still need to make your GFR or have your GFR at a constant level. So what we're going to see here is that the sympathetic nervous system responds to try and keep GFR at an elevated level, even though we've got a decreased amount of blood flowing to the kidneys overall. So here's how this plays out. In response to that sympathetic activation, we're going to see constriction of the afferent arteriole, and that's going to actually occur through activation of a receptor type in smooth muscle called alpha-1 receptors. We also get an increased release of renin. Now, the constriction of the afferent arteriole overall is going to decrease our glomerular filtration rate. But remember, we're also going to see that glomerular filtration rate stay acceptable. So it's not as high as it was, but it's coming down a little bit. And that's all because you don't have to make as much urine. If you took urine out of your body, if you made urine, what ultimately would happen, you would see a decrease in your overall blood pressure. Guess you have to kind of go back and think about the sympathetic nervous system and one of the overall effects that you see in response to sympathetic activation, and that's going to be an elevated blood pressure. So you lower that GFR, it allows your blood pressure to stay, or rather rise, due to the fact essentially that you're making less urine there. The renin sets in motion the renin-angiotensin pathway, and you'll see as we come down to hormonal regulation, that's going to also play a role in affecting GFR, the whole RAAP, renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. So let's bridge into the hormonal regulation. You'll see here hormonal regulation, two hormones, angiotensin II and atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP. We've seen these hormones in previous chapters, but they both have opposing effects on GFR. Angiotensin II is going to be a hormone that's intended to decrease GFR. Remember, if your GFR is elevated, then you're going to basically be producing larger amounts of urine. The production of urine can actually lower your blood pressure. Well, if you recall way back in chapter 18, one of the intended goals of the renin-angiotensin pathway was an elevation of blood pressure. So it should make some sense that you want to decrease your GFR, especially if your blood pressure is low. Because if you decrease GFR, you'll make less urine, allowing you to hopefully increase your blood pressure. So the stimulus for angiotensin II is decreased blood volume or low blood pressure. Angiotensin II is going to cause constriction of both the afferent and efferent arterioles. However, if you look at it and we compare this once again, the afferent arteriole, because of the presence of the JG cells, just has more muscle. So the constriction is uneven. You get a greater constrictive effect on the afferent arteriole than you do on the efferent arteriole. And because the afferent arteriole constricts to a greater degree, the overall effect is a decrease in GFR. Atrial natriuretic peptide is the only regulatory means that you're going to see in the chart that actually is going to serve to increase GFR. Atrial natriuretic peptide is a hormone that's released when your blood pressure essentially is too high. If your blood pressure is elevated, your heart can have a harder time trying to eject blood. That may cause the blood to back up into the ventricle, and consequently it may back up into the atria, and blood backing up into the atria is going to cause a stretching of the atrial walls. In response to that stretch, you'll see atrial natriuretic peptide released. The effect of atrial natriuretic peptide is to cause relaxation of mesangial cells. These mesangial cells are seen in between the loops of the glomerulus. So here are the loops of the glomerulus, and they are the mesangial cells. Once these mesangial cells relax, it actually allows these loops to stretch out. As these loops stretch out and extend, it actually results in the fact that you have a greater surface area available for filtration. Well, if you have more surface area available for filtration, you will get more filtration. And therefore, your glomerular filtration rate will become elevated, allowing you to produce greater amounts of urine, and therefore also lower, hopefully, your blood pressure. So, atrial natriuretic peptide, released during times when your blood pressure would be elevated. That elevated blood pressure may cause your afterload to increase, which could cause blood to back up and ultimately cause stretching of the atrial wall. When the ANP is released, you'll see the mesangial cells relax. That increases the total amount of surface area available for filtration, and therefore it will also allow you to increase filtration rate, and therefore hopefully you'll make more urine and your blood pressure should fall. So these are the 1, 2, 3 major categories of regulating GFR. Like I said, you definitely want to take a look at this chart and understand what's going on here. All right, with that excuse me, item being discussed, that will conclude our discussion about glomerular filtration.